For our third talk, we'd really like to start zooming in a little bit more on Clare's spirituality. And in some ways today we're focusing on Clare as the foundress, founding a feminine expression of Franciscan life. And therefore we're going to focus on the development of Clare's form of life, and we're going to be looking at the rule of Clare. I think many of us, especially as Americans, have an immediate instinctive reaction against looking at a rule. I remember some years ago, the Belgian historian Jean-François Godet was giving a workshop here to the Poor Clares convent here in Washington. And one sister was talking about her own difficulty of relating to a lot of the imagery that Clare uses in her letters. This bridal imagery, the spouse of Christ. And she said, I don't really feel that high on a personal level and can enter into these passionate documents where they speak of this very deep personal relationship with God in this nuptial language. And Jean-François gave a very interesting answer to that. He said, let's face it, he said, gifts are different for different people. Clare is speaking out of, in those letters, her own very highly personal experience of her relationship with God, the gifts that she had received in contemplation over many years of contemplative experience. And they might not be your gifts, he said to this sister. Perhaps you do not have these gifts of this intense experience of the Lord in that way. What really does matter is that you have professed to live a certain way of life. You are following your rule. You are following your constitutions, the way that is mapped out for you as living a gospel life. And that's really the important thing in your life, that living this gospel life, you will open yourself up to perhaps the gifts that the Lord might give you in your own life. But the important thing is that you are following the way of Jesus that was expressed in the Gospels, and that in many ways is the whole basis of our Franciscan charism, living the Gospels in a radical way. The important thing is to live the life. And so we want to look at that rule, the rule of life that Clare fought for and worked for, that expressed her own experience in so many, many ways. And that will be our focus. As I say, we Americans have a basic allergy sometimes to any kind of juridical content, but again, we need to focus at this because it isn't just a bunch of laws. It is a rising out of her gospel experience of what is important of living a gospel life. So as we begin today, let's just review a little bit what we said last time in terms of some basic evolutions of the rule of Clare. We mentioned the year 1212. Clare makes her decision to follow Francis's gospel life. And at this time, or shortly after, Francis wrote a small form of life, a formula vitae for Clare. She quotes at least part of it, or the nugget of it, in her own rule later on, when she looks back at the important things that shaped her life and her relationship with Francis. Clare reminisces in the 6th chapter of her rule. After the Most High Heavenly Father saw fit by His grace to enlighten my heart to do penance, according to the example and teaching of our Blessed Father Francis, shortly after his own conversion, I willingly promised him obedience together with my sisters. And when the Blessed Father saw that we had no fear of poverty, hard work, trial, shame, or contempt of the world, but instead regarded such things as delight, moved by compassion, he wrote a form for life for us as follows. And then what we talked about last time, these words. Because by divine inspiration you have made yourselves daughters and servants of the Most High King, the Heavenly Father, and have taken the Spirit as your spouse, choosing to live according to the perfection of the gospel, I resolve and promise for myself and for my brothers to always have that same loving care and solicitude for you as I have for them. We notice here the elements then that are central for Clare: divine inspiration, the conviction that God had been working in her life and calling her, the notion of following. Because of this divine inspiration, she has been led to follow Christ, to follow the way of the Holy Gospel in a radical way. And especially for her, this is the self-emptying, the poverty of Jesus, and the care of Francis. That she is part of this whole Franciscan movement, and that therefore she is bound to Francis and to his brothers in a special way. We saw how this was changed, or impacted at least a little bit, by the decisions of the Fourth Lateran Council. The idea that there are to be no more new religious rules, that anyone who wishes to form a new community should follow a rule that already has been approved by the Church. Now, as we saw those two things coming in shortly afterwards, are seen, perhaps most historians see them as attempts by Francis and Clare in some way to, at least for outer circumstances, to make Clare and her sisters look like other traditional religious orders in the Church. And those are Clare taking the title of abbess, so that she is seen as the leader of, in fact, a community of religious women. By granting this title, she is recognized as somehow seen as fitting into the canonical structure of the Church. And then Clare writing to the Pope, Innocent III, to receive her privilege of poverty, that she wants to guard what she sees as an essential element of this following of Christ in her own rule, and that is following Jesus in his self-emptying by not accepting revenues. Again, the tradition here that we're coming from is that a monastery of nuns especially has to have enough income, endowed income, sure income, to guarantee the support of the sisters. And Clare says we are not going to do that. We are going to live from day to day by the work of our hands, by the free will offerings of people, taking no thought for the morrow and imitation of Jesus. And I want a guarantee from the Pope that I'm not going to be forced by the goodwill of people, either ecclesiastical personages or noble people who are trying to, quote, help us out of their thoughtfulness, but we are going to not be forced to accept property. Then we saw how, after the visitation of Cardinal Ugolino as papal legate for the area, the now spreading and growing movement associated with San Damiano comes under increasingly church surveillance and recognition. And Cardinal Ugolino, during these years, by sending the Cistercian monk Ambrose as a visitator to the sisters, ends up drawing up a way of life for the sisters. The so-called rule of Ugolino, a rather severe tone in many ways, but places the sisters' life very firmly on the rule of Benedict. In other words, he's taking for granted that the sisters must conform to an already established way of life. And so he says, gives them the rule of Benedict to be the stable basis of their life in all things that do not conflict with the more specified directions that he gives them in the form of life that is to follow. Again, which has extremely traditional values. The imposition of the strict cloister upon the sisters, which is traditional increasingly by monastic reformers. There is no mention of poverty, no mention of the link with the friars. In other words, some of these things that are very special to Clare receive somewhat short shrift in the letter of Ugolino. Time goes on. Clare is living under this way of life. Francis dies. Cardinal Ugolino is elected Pope in 1227. And she writes to the Pope in 1228, Cardinal Ugolino, now Pope Gregory IX, to reconfirm her privilege of poverty. And she has reason for this. It is because as much as Ugolino, now the Pope, as much as he loved Francis and Clare, he doubted their practical judgment. He's saying, you people don't know how to live in the real world. and I am going to look out for you, sisters. And in fact, we know at this same time, Ugolino is forcing the sisters of other Poor Clare convents. We know, for example, the convent near Perugia at Montelucido is forced by the Holy Father to accept gifts of lands and vineyards and olive groves to support the sisters. The sisters were not originally willing to accept this, but the Pope says, you're going to take this from the benefactors. They know what's good for you. You sisters should accept these donations. And Clare is saying, this is not going to happen to me. And she writes again to reconfirm this privilege of poverty that Innocent III had given her, in some ways to stand up to the attempt of the Pope, again, assuredly in terms of his own mind of helping Clare out, but to trying to maintain and to fight for her own vision. It's interesting enough that Agnes of Prague, we'll be talking about in our next lecture, when she founded her convent of Poor Clares in the city of Prague, also wants this same privilege. And Gregory IX is basically telling her, no, you are not to have this privilege of poverty. This is for Clare alone. You should be forced, like other sisters, to live according to the commonly accepted norms of religious life. And she has a long struggle, really, with Gregory IX Agnes does, in order to fight for her vision to live according to the way of life of Clare. This picture is complicated in 1247 with another pope coming in and thinking he should legislate a way of life for the sisters. And this is Pope Innocent IV, who, as much as he loved the Franciscan friars and the Poor Clares, was in some ways serenely cavalier about the value of Franciscan poverty. To him, the main thing was living a religious life, getting your job done. I don't care about your scruples about poverty. And here now, he issued, over the course of the years, things had happened, other circumstances had come up, and he decided to reissue, if you will, the rule of Ugolino again, taking account of changing circumstances. And so he issued a rule to supplant the rule of Ugolino for the convent of the Poor Clares. Well, let's talk first about the good news about this document, the Rule of Innocent. Here, it clearly states that the way of life of the poor ladies of San Damiano is based on the way of Francis. He eliminates the idea that their way of life is based on the rule of Benedict. He says they are indeed Franciscan, and their way of life is based on the rule of Francis, which of course now is an accepted, officially approved way of life in the church, something that wasn't the case in 1219, because the Friars Minor had not received yet a definitive approval. He says, for example, that the liturgy of the sisters is to follow the liturgy of the friars, that they are part of the Franciscan movement. There is a downside to this, however, I think we should mention that, and that is the sisters are placed very firmly under the control of the friars in terms of their government. That they are part of the Franciscan movement to the extent that the general minister and provincial minister of the friars are the overseers of the sisters. That it is the ministers of the Friars Minor who appoint visitors to the convent, who appoints chaplains for the sisters, who appoints confessors in various ways, confirms elections, and so that in some ways the supervision of the women now, they lose their autonomy in this rule and are being placed very strongly under the control of the friars, but at the same time are seen as part of the Franciscan movement. The bad news for the sisters, of course, in some ways losing their autonomy is bad news, but the real bad news is that Innocent goes into even more details about dress, about fasting, about enclosure, legislating in very precise and restricted detail these aspects of their life. And in regard to poverty, is even laxer than the rule of Ugolino. Ugolino doesn't mention the specific Franciscan values of poverty. The rule of Innocent specifically says the sisters may accept possessions. As he says in the rule of 1247, you may be permitted to receive, to have in common, and to freely retain produce and possessions. A procurator may be had in every monastery of the order to deal with these possessions in a becoming way. This is a lay person who becomes, in a sense, a business manager for the sisters to look over their properties which are providing them an endowed income. Now, many of the sisters did not like this new rule, and for various reasons. The loss of their freedom, the over-restrictive regulations in regard to cloister and fasting and other details of life, and some for deeply spiritual reasons in the sense of wanting to live very much according to the real value of Franciscan poverty, of not possessing anything in a radical way, and living from day to day by the work of their hands, and not wanting to accept endowed incomes. So that this rule was very poorly received, and the Pope was forced to back off a few years later in saying, those convents who want to really live according to the rule of Ugolino and not my new rule, they will be allowed to do so. So in some ways he backs off from imposing this rule. In any case, it is at this time that Clare begins finally to say, I have had enough of people telling me how I am going to live my gospel life. I am going to write my own rule. And so Clare picks up her quill and begins to set it to parchment and begins to say, what is the rule of life that I feel I want my sisters to live by? My life is nearing its end. What is going to be my vision of life that I want as much as possible my sisters to live by? So Clare begins the process then of writing her own rule of life. Now it's very important to see here what goes into this rule. What does Clare have in front of her, if you will? Think of yourself perhaps going to your student days, writing a term paper. You're trying to synthesize what you really got out of all of this. And what you have before you, what are the resources you're going to draw on in some way as you write your rule? Well, first of all, Clare obviously has the Gospels. She is trying to say we are living a gospel life. We are radically trying to follow Jesus. That's what our life is all about. By divine inspiration, going back to the very beginning, we have been led to follow Christ. And so it is the Gospels, but a certain reading of the Gospels, certain things that we'll be talking about, leap out at her as central values of the Gospels and on which she is going to be basing her life. The second thing she has, as she tells us in the 6th chapter of her own rule, is the example, the teaching of Francis. She has chosen to follow Jesus in the way of Francis, and therefore those teachings of Francis and his values are going to be very, very important for her. She has, of course, now the rule of the Friars Minor that was confirmed in 1223. And so many of her insights she is going to draw from the very words of Francis in his rule for the friars, where they are applicable, she feels, to her own way of life, her own way as a woman, a cloistered woman, of living this Franciscan value. She has other writings of Francis. She has his teaching and preaching, if you will, his over the years, and the advice and spiritual direction of other friars. So there is the whole experience of Francis himself, and the continual care and guidance of other friars over the years is a resource on which she is going to draw. Certainly, she also is going to draw on the rule of Ugolino, in the sense of the basically Benedictine framework that she has been living now for 30 years. There are some things about this rule that were good, and Clare has over experience seen that there are certain elements here of this more monastic structure that have served us well. And at least, and to some extent, they serve as a negative element. That is something to react against the rule of Ugolino and the rule of innocence. I really don't want what they have. So she has those in the background. And finally, and I don't want to say most importantly, but certainly very important that you see in her rule, is the fact that Clare, at this point now, has over 30 years of experience. 35 years of experience, really, as a woman leading a community, as a superior. The wisdom that has been generated in simple community living. Week after week, year after year, Clare sitting down with her sisters, trying to discern what are our values and what are the things that we have learned over the years that work and that don't work. And what the distilled wisdom of these 35 years of living that have gone into that document. So we see then, these are the main elements that Clare is drawing on. The gospel itself, at least a certain reading of the gospels. Francis, his way of living the gospel life as that was transmitted to the friars and in the Franciscan rule of the Friars Minor and the teaching of the friars. In some ways, papal, ecclesial documents, the wisdom of those in some ways reacting against some of the things that are in these documents. And then her own experience of living her Franciscan life as a cloistered woman with her sisters at San Damiano over the years. What have I learned? The story of the approval of this rule is indeed a marvelous thing and a wonderful thing in many ways. We don't know when exactly Clare began to write, but certainly within several years she had finished this document. After some years of badgering, her rule was finally given approval by the Cardinal Protector of the Order. That is Cardinal Reynal de Segni, who was the nephew of Gregory IX, the former Cardinal Ugolino. In other words, the Cardinal Protector was, after Ugolino, was his own nephew, Reynal de Segni. And he approved this rule on September the 16th, 1252. Clare wanted definitive approval. She wanted papal approval. And we see the first week of August 1253, the next year, Innocent IV was staying in Perugia. That's where the papal court was residing at the time. And he comes to visit, really, the dying abbess Clare on her deathbed. She puts before him a final request. That is to confirm once and for all, by papal document, her rule. The Pope takes the text that has already been drawn up that she has by Cardinal Reynal with his signature, already written back with him to Perugia, and because the time is short, Clare is dying, there is not enough time to draw up a new document or to have the scribes draw up a new manuscript. He simply adds a preamble and a conclusion to the existing manuscript. And then actually in the margins of the manuscript that you can see in Assisi, he writes in the margin, this is to be, with his own handwriting, this is to be approved as is. In other words, I've seen this, I want this is to be approved. It was granted the papal bull on August the 9th, 1253, rushed back by couriers to Assisi, and it says in the manuscript, someone else wrote in the actual manuscript of the rule, and when Blessed Clare received it, she embraced it and kissed it many times. That finally, what she had been looking for and struggling for her own life, her own values, have received papal confirmation, and Clare died 2 days later, 2 days after the rule was definitively approved on August the 11th, 1253. So then in some ways, this rule, you can almost see the Cardinal Protector telling the Pope, give this lady what she wants, I mean, the poor woman is dying, give her approval. I think it's important to recognize, however, this rule was approved only for Clare and her sisters at San Damiano. In other words, the other poor Clares elsewhere in the world were still living under either the rule of Innocent or the rule of Ugolino at this time. The bull specifically states, as you see in your text of the rule, Innocent bishop, servants of the servants of God, to his beloved daughters in Christ, Clare the abbess, and the other sisters of the monastery of San Damiano in Assisi, greetings and peace. It is for you, this community. And against the Clares do not have any central government. Each house is totally autonomous, so that this rule was granted for Clare and her sisters alone, although other small numbers of communities elsewhere fought and got permission to receive that rule. Others were still living under these other forms of government. Sister Margaret Carney a sister from Pittsburgh, who is presently the superior of one of the Franciscan Third Order congregations based in Pittsburgh, was the first woman to receive her doctorate in theology from the Antonianum in Rome. And she did her thesis as a study of Clare's Rule, which is due to be published soon as a book by the Franciscan Institute Press on her study of the Rule. And Margaret, who was involved actually in the writing of the Third Order Rule, the new Third Order Rule for the sisters and members of the Third Order Regular, was fascinated with this idea of a rule. But when she was doing her doctoral study, she says, how can I try to understand rule? How did Clare finally organize her rule? And then suddenly she had a wonderful insight. And she began to realize Clare sewed a lot. I mean, that's what she did with her days, to work. Clare and her sisters supported themselves by sewing, by needlework. And she began to recognize that the various towns of Assisi had a distinctive pattern. I was led to think of Ireland. The Irish fishing villages in Ireland all have distinctive patterns of sweaters. And I was told the reason for that was, in Ireland, that these fishermen going out to sea in these small boats, if there was a storm and the ship was destroyed and the bodies washed up on shore, they would be able to tell what village these men were from by the sweaters that they wore. I mean, that's the reason for that. But in any case, the various towns of Italy had the distinctive pattern of sewing. And at this time, the distinctive Assisi pattern of embroidery was to construct a very elaborate frame with all kinds of elaborate detail, a quite wide border that framed your central picture that you were really focusing on. And it's very interesting because Margaret suddenly dawned, this is how Clare has constructed her rule. If you look at it, the first chapters of the rule and the last chapters of the rule are an elaborate canonical framework, if you will, surrounding and protecting, in some ways, by needed juridical regulations, the inner core, the central chapters of the rule. So that if you look at the rule, you see chapters 1 to 5 are canonical, dealing with what is this movement, what is our identity in the church. It deals with how people come into this way of life. It deals with some of the regulations concerning religious observances in our way of life. It deals with the government of the community. And then suddenly, if you look at chapter 6, we change tone dramatically, because chapters 6, 7, and 8 are the inner core of Clare's rule. They talk about the real values that are motivating her. And here you have the heart of the rule. It suddenly changes tone from canonical legislation to very deeply autobiographical language. And it begins there. Chapter 6 deals with the lack of possessions. What the thing that I read here at the beginning of our session today. After the Most High Heavenly Father saw fit by His grace to enlighten my heart to do penance, after the example of Francis, Clare talks about what indeed this form of life was. And it is chapters 6, 7, and 8 that talk about her central values. The lack of possessions, the way the sisters are to support themselves by the work of their hands, that they shall not acquire anything of their own, and the care of the sick members of the community. The mutual care and concern that the sisters are to have for one another. These central values are highlighted by Clare. Then, after that, she again returns to necessary canonical elaborations of her way of life. The penance that is to be imposed on the sisters who sin in chapter 9, the admonition and correction of the sisters by the superior, the way the enclosure of the sisters is to be guarded, and then finally in chapter 12, the relationship with the order in regard to the order of Friars Minor, that is, the visitators, the chaplains, and the protector of the order. So you see here dealing with necessary canonical elaborations. Every community needs a certain structure, if you will, to protect its way of life and to the way we're going to live this out concretely. But then in the middle are these central values that we see and that she is focusing on. If we want to look at the rule, I think to look at it, and the Pope recognized in some ways when his rule of bull of confirmation, Innocent IV recognized what really were the central aspects of Clare. He said, "You have asked us," he said, "to confirm the form of life that Blessed Francis gave you and that you have freely accepted." So he's recognizing that Clare's rule that she has written is for her a synthesis of the inner values that Francis gave, along with what she has learned over the years and the necessary canonical structure to give her life a juridical focus, but that she is living out of the vision. And what is the vision? And as the Pope himself expresses it, he says, "According to this form of life, you should live together in unity of mind and heart, and in the profession of the highest poverty." And in those words, he has summarized the twin values that Clare has in her rule and in her way of life. What are her Franciscan values? The achievement of a unity of mind. What Cardinal Regnal de Segni said as Cardinal Protector when he approved the rule. Again, it's written on the same piece of paper. So it goes on to talk about the confirmation. And the Cardinal had said the year before, in 1252, when he, from his part, approved the way of Clare, is he said, "Following the footprints of Christ himself, you have chosen to live and close, serving the Lord in the highest poverty, so that with the highest freedom you might be the Lord's servants." And as he says, "We ratify, therefore, the manner, again, of holy unity and highest poverty, which Blessed Father Francis gave you for your observance." So again, the Cardinal, too, as the Cardinal Protector, saw these two elements as being absolutely central. In complete unity of mind and heart, and in, quote, the highest poverty. I think what we want to look at right now, at least, is that first value. The value of unity of mind and heart. This is a difficult thing in many, many ways, because Clare, like Francis, recognized that each of her sisters, as Francis did for his friars, each of them had been inspired by God in their own life. Each had felt the inspiration of the Lord. Each person, each sister had her own distinct call from the Lord. And yet somehow, these diverse calls given to very different people could be lived together in a community of mind and heart. How was this to be achieved? Through mutual care and service, a metaphor that Clare uses so often, humbly washing the feet of one another. How these different people manage to live together in a unity of mind and heart is through mutual attentiveness to one another's needs. And so we'd just like to talk about some of those things for a few minutes, because I think when you try to read what looks like a legal document like this, you might miss so many of the central gospel values that Clare is talking about. First, she is talking about inspiration. She is talking about the fact that the sisters have received a call from God. By divine inspiration, she says, I followed Francis. The Lord, Heavenly Father, saw fit by His grace to enlighten my heart. She is talking about her own life, that she has been led by the Lord. But also she recognizes that her other sisters have also received their own call. And so she begins chapter 2, if by divine inspiration anyone should come to us desiring to accept this life. She has seen that call also in the work of her other sisters. And you see that over and over again in the rule. For example, this woman that joins, she says a little further on in chapter 2, sentence 9, let the abbess and the sisters take care not to be concerned about her temporal affairs, so that she may freely dispose of her possessions as the Lord may inspire her. It's up to that sister that is joining. What am I going to do with the things I brought from the world? Well, how am I going to dispose of these things? I'm going to give them away. That the Lord is going to show me. And again, we see this note of inspiration. Following Francis, for example, in chapter 10 on the correction of the sisters, she sees that the way of life takes precedence and the way the individual has been inspired to follow it over the governmental structures. Because, as she says, let the abbess admonish and visit the sisters, humbly and charitably correcting them, but not commanding them anything that is against their spirit, that is against their soul in the form of our profession. And this is just, of course, a takeover from the rule of Francis, that the friar, or the sister in this case, has given herself to a form of life. She has given herself, if you will, to following her star and the call of the gospel. And you cannot compel someone to, against that inspiration of the Lord in their life, to follow the vision. The way that the Lord has been leading them to follow the vision has to come first, over against the organizational structures of what the abbess might feel is necessary to do. So that she sees very strongly this note of inspiration. And therefore the real issue for the sisters is in many ways, am I with God in my own life? Am I still hearing and still following that call? An image that Clare will use later on in her letters to Agnes, that we will see in the next talk, is very much the idea, as Rachel, be mindful of your origin. Always go back to your beginning. Always go back to your vocation. And so, are you really with the Lord? And so she's very convinced that there is this inspiration going on in the lives of her sisters. But again, these sisters somehow have been led to live together. And how are we going to live together in mutual love? As we know, Francis had a tremendous sense of brotherhood. But how does this notion of fraternity, in a Franciscan sense, transfer into this community of women who are living together? Now, it's very different for the Friars Minor. The Friars Minor at this time are an itinerant brotherhood. They are not living in fixed and stable communities. They are on the road. And the way that they are going to show their brotherhood as very mobile men wandering around preaching is going to take a different focus than a group of women who are living together in a house that they can't go out of, that they are there with one another day and night, living with one another in this enclosed community. How are they going to express this sisterhood with one another? And the demands on them are going to be different and in some ways stronger than the demands of the friars. Where Francis says to the friars, wherever the brothers meet one another, let them show that they are brothers. But I'm not living with these people necessarily day and night. These sisters are. And how are they going to express that? Now, one thing that is pointed out that we have to keep in mind is the simple fact that most women at this time, especially most women of Clare's background and class, and most of her sisters, in fact, lived in very large, extended families. These women were used to living in communities, de facto, in large families, in large extended families, where generally, like in Clare's own home, it wasn't simply her father and mother and her other sisters living there, it was her aunts and uncles and cousins living in this house also. A large extended family living together in the house. For us Americans especially, this is, I think, very difficult. We are used to people, especially once they, quote, leave home, they got their education, they got their job, they're living in their own apartments. And I remember when I first went over to Italy and was meeting my relatives there, who were talking about my family, they found it very hard to understand, for example, that my own cousin, who was a school teacher as a single man, had his own apartment in the same town that his parents lived. Well, why wouldn't he? They thought this was strange. Well, why wouldn't he, even as an adult man, live with his parents? That the notion of family is still much stronger, but the fact is Clare and other women were used to living together. And in fact, many monasteries were really family groups. Let's face it, let's look. Clare's own two sisters, and later her own mother, joined her as sisters at San Damiano. And that's not unusual, that we see many monasteries, in fact, of sisters, Benedictine and later Poor Clares, were really almost family networks of women, of people who knew one another, quote, in the world, and maybe even lived physically with one another, come into a religious community together and transfer their extended family, in some ways, into a religious community. So we have to see that these women, in some ways, are used to living together much more than us. But they form now a community of sisters. And this is extremely important. When the very beginning of the rule, the very first chapter of the rule, where Clare talks about her identity in the church, she says, this is the form of life of the order of poor sisters that Blessed Francis established, namely to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. She talks about the order of poor sisters. And further on in the rule, she said when the other sisters must obey the successors of Blessed Francis and Sister Clare and the other canonically elected abbesses who will succeed her. She refers to herself as Sister Clare. Very interesting. She doesn't say, I am, quote, Reverend Mother. She does not use that language of being the mother of the other sisters. She is Sister Clare. She does not use the word as Innocent did, or as Hugelin did in his rule, the rule of the poor enclosed nuns. She does not call her sisters nuns. She simply calls them sisters. And that's very, very important, because Clare's whole tone is very different than the rule of Benedict, where the abbot or the abbess is literally the father figure or mother figure of the community, the spiritual guide, and in some way the monks or the nuns are the disciples, literally, of the abbot or abbess, who really is in some ways their spiritual director and the formator of the community. Clare did not see herself this way. That our sisterhood is created by the mutual care and interaction of all the sisters, one for the other. Granted, I have a position of responsibility in this, of leadership, of keeping us together as a community in some ways, and making sure that we are interrelating in the best way that we can. But our sisterhood arises out of the mutual interaction of the sisters. It's not, if you will, a pre-existing thing that we kind of plug into, that the community somehow exists up here in some kind of platonic ideal world. There is, quote, the community, and I plug into it and become part of it. No, the community is created out of the interrelations of the sisters, one with the other. By me being a sister to you, you being a sister to me, we have this community. And it is created out of our own distinct individualities, caring for one another, nourishing one another, giving to one another. We have community. And I think it's very important, it's very interesting, isn't it, that for many sisters, what has become a title for many of us was really a term used to express relationship. We say sister as a matter of a title, but it really is describing who I am to you. I am your sister. I am your brother. That it talks about the way I relate with you. And we see, therefore, Clare is talking about these women nourishing one another in their mutual needs. And we see this note, then, of a tremendous mutuality. And Clare takes over this note very definitely from Francis, because the word she uses in her own rule later on, and again, one of those central core chapters, she takes from the rule of Francis that phrase that we friars are very familiar with, and translating into feminine language. For if a mother loves and nourishes her child according to the flesh, should not a sister love and nourish her sister according to the Spirit even more lovingly? That this central Franciscan value of, quote, fraternitas, of being a brother and a sister, is seen by Clare as how this is created, being sisters to one another. This, in fact, creates the community of mutual care and concern. What we see in the letter of Clare, then, is such a tremendous mutuality. And what strikes me, as a person who teaches sometimes the history of religious life and familiar with the rule of Benedict, the rule of Augustine, the other rules that existed at this time. What strikes you about the rule of Clare is her insistence that this community, this sisterhood, has to be the responsibility of everybody. It is not something that you can pawn off on the superiors and say that's their job is to make community. And I just kind of sit back and plug into this thing that somehow the superiors create. That if there's going to be a community, I have to do my part. Where she says the bond of perfection, the bond of unity, and she uses that phrase several times in her rule, has to be the responsibility of everybody. And you see how she does this over and over and over again in the rule. For example, in chapter 2, she talks about how sisters to come into the community. If by divine inspiration anybody should come to us desiring to accept this life, very interesting, the abbess is required to seek the consent of all the sisters. And if the majority have agreed, she may receive her. That's very different from the friars, where the minister can receive whoever he wants without consulting the brothers. Why? Because they don't have to live with this guy. Necessarily. I mean, they might be physically with him in the house for a period of time. If they really can't get along with him, they can always get transferred to another house. If there's very deep personality conflicts, because they are mobile. But Clare realizes that if we're going to take a new woman into our community, we're going to be here for the rest of our lives. You know, it's not up to me to let this woman in the community. You know, the other people have to have something to say about this. We're going to be all here together. None of us are going anywhere. And if I want these women to live with this woman, to accept her in, they better have something to say about it. And you can see her saying that if we are going to accept a sister into the community, it's we that are accepting the sister. I'm not accepting the sister. We all have to agree to bring this woman in, because we're going to be living day by day with this woman. And is she going to fit? And are we willing to accept her? So you see her very much conscious that even on something like that, the acceptance of new members of the community, this has to be a community decision. It's not my decision. It's a community decision. Again, in chapter 4, for example, the role of the abbess, she talks about what the superior is done, and she is very clear that whoever is elected has to reflect on the kind of burden she has undertaken, and she should strive to preside over the others more by her virtues and behavior than by her office, so that moved by her example, the sisters may obey her more out of love than out of fear. In other words, why the sisters follow me and why I am a leader is because I lead by what I do. It isn't because you know I'm the boss and I'm laying down the law. That's why you're listening to me. It's because you see in me a person who's doing everything that I would ever ask you, I am doing myself. And that you can see by my dedication and by my example, I am calling you into unity. And in them beautiful words, let her console those who are afflicted. Let her be the last refuge for those who are troubled. I have to be the one that everybody in the community can come to and feel free to come to, because I am giving them strength to live their life. And as it calls directly for consultation, the abbess is bound to call her sisters together at least once a week in the chapter, where both she and her sisters should humbly confess their faults and failings to one another. And let her consult with the sisters about everything that pertains to the welfare and good of the monastery. For the Lord frequently reveals what is best to the least among us. So that it is really, in her mind, a collegial government. Clare always talks about, in her rule, about me and my sisters. She doesn't place herself in a different role than them. She is one of them. And what has to be done by all. And you see this care and concern coming through the rule. For example, silence, which again in the contemplative life is an important value. where many rooms have to double for different purposes, and certain places have to be said, we're not going to be talking there, to respect this. But again, she says, if there's something people have to talk about, then let's not get scroopy, let them talk. If there's something that as a necessity comes up, then they have to say something. She takes care about allowing people who are sick to recreate. Maybe they're depressed, maybe they're sick and not feeling well. Well, we have to give them a little more freedom to talk and to be able to share their burdens and their fears with one another. How we have to have times of conversation for them. She has statements for the use of money and gifts, unlike her sisters, and we'll talk about that next time. The sisters could receive money. How that is to be treated. If people give gifts to the sisters, how the superior should attend to that. So there's a lack of rigidity in the rule of Clare, and this idea of caring for the needs and concerns of one another. What we see in so many ways, and we'll continue this when we come back in our next session as we enter into the real self-emptying. How is, in fact, this possible, this type of mutual care and concern? But what we see as a central gospel value for Clare is the unity of mind and heart that is achieved by letting go in so many ways of our expectations and demands of one another. To really believe, to trust in the goodness of God and the real grace that God is working in the other person. Really the gift that this other person is to me. By believing in that, by trusting in that, this is the only way that a community is going to be created. By really believing that God has inspired this woman to live this life with me. And therefore this woman is a gift of God to me. And how do I nourish and foster that gift in this other person? And that's only possible, and that's what we'll talk about when we come back, that's only possible if we approach this sister or this brother emptied of ourselves in order to recognize this gift. But I think to me this is one of the great gospel values that Clare has to tell us, is living together in a unity of mind and heart, of attentiveness to the person of the other, and seeing no one in a position of superiority, but all being equally gifted, equally inspired by the Lord, and attending to that common inspiration that we have received to build up a community together out of caring for one another. Okay, we'll see you at the next class. Okay, that was about probably 50 minutes. Last time, when we were examining the gospel values of Clare, we focused on her idea of unity of mind and heart. But such a unity of mind and heart, I think all of us realize, living together in love is accomplished only when I give of myself, when I am willing to forget myself for the sake of others. And so this leads us then, in this last talk, to talk about the other foundational gospel value that the Pope recognized in the rule of Clare. And that is a very Franciscan term, in, quote, the highest poverty. You have chosen to live in the highest poverty. Clare refers to this, looking back in her testament. Among the gifts that we have received and do daily receive from our benefactor, the Father of mercies, and for which we must express the deepest thanks to the glorious Father of Christ, there is our vocation. She thanks God for this inspiration that we talked about. She continues, the apostle tells us, know your vocation. Know your calling. And she says what this is in the very next sentence. My vocation, she said, the Son of God has been made for us the way, which our Blessed Father Francis, his true lover and imitator, has shown and taught us by word and example. Our vocation is following the footsteps of Jesus. Jesus has become for me the way. One of these things, her being constant, remembered and called to her vocation, was the Eucharist. My colleague here, Michael Blastic at the Washington Theological Union, gave a talk last year at the Medieval Conference on Clare and the Eucharist. And I thought this would be a helpful transition as we move from unity to mind and heart to the inner self-emptying. Because for Clare, the Eucharist was a continual reminder to her of her calling, what she was called to be, how she was to follow Jesus, and what this meant in her life. All of us know, I think, that Clare, like Francis, was very devoted to the Eucharist. One of the things that Clare and her sister supported themselves doing was making altar linens. Even at that time, Clare and her sisters were making corporals and other instruments for the celebration of the Eucharist. The legend also tells us that Clare would often receive Holy Communion with tears, that she was very much drawn and caught up in the mystery that was taking place. And one of the things that comes through so much, and the note that Michael Blastic draws out on this question of the Eucharist, is going back to a foundational Eucharistic text. And that is in the 13th chapter of St. John's Gospel, where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples at the Last Supper. Because the other thing that strikes you when you read the process of canonization, when you read the legend of Clare, is how often the witnesses go back to this facet of Clare's life. That she so often cared for the weakness of her sisters, and that Clare often literally washed the feet of her sisters. The other sisters remember her chiefly in this role as the servant, as the one who poured herself out for the other sisters. As the document of her life tells us, in the legend, when they single out her virtue of poverty, poverty in all things was in harmony with poverty in spirit. That is true humility. And she conformed herself to that idea of poverty through that self-emptying and that constant care for the needs of her sisters. This central metaphor that she has of washing the feet of the sisters, self-emptying in humility through charity, through compassion, through attentiveness to the needs of others, is what in so many ways she saw in the Eucharist. That this caring of one another and this ritual washing of feet was not a pious exercise, but really an act that made her a follower of Christ. It's interesting, but this focus on the washing of the feet that is singled out by the witnesses who remembered Clare, and which is brought out in the legend, was something that was very central to the rule of Benedict. This is perhaps one of the things that Clare picked up from her years of living under the rule of Benedict. In chapter 35 of the rule, for example, it states that when the waiters switched in the rule of Benedict, the person who had been waiting for a week and then the other waiter took their place, that both of them were to go around and wash the feet of all the brothers, that was part of their table service. And of course, the very famous passage in the rule of Benedict, when guests came to the monastery, the abbot was to humbly welcome the guests and wash the feet of the guests, because they were Jesus coming in, and it is us serving and caring for Jesus in our midst in the person of the abbot. It was in the person of the guest. It was also something that Francis seized upon in his own perception. In the fourth admonition, Francis talks about being a superior, being called to the position of leadership in the community. And he said a person should be no more attached to the job of being superior than they would be to the task of washing the feet of the brothers. That leadership is service. The model of authority is service. And so, in so many ways, the Eucharist is, after all, the self-emptying of God. It is, in this way we see Jesus in the Eucharist giving himself to us in a ritual form, expressing who Jesus is for us as the one who serves. And as we are drawn into the life of Jesus, we are also drawn into his life of care and service for one another through our participation in this meal. As many exegetes have noticed in the 13th chapter of John's Gospel, there is no institution account in John's Gospel. There is no part in John's Gospel where it says Jesus took bread and broke it. Jesus took wine and passed it to his disciples and saying, "This is my body, this is my blood." Instead, John gives us the account of the washing of the feet. And the purpose of that is to say what we are celebrating in the Eucharist is a Christian community that is founded and kept in existence by mutual care and service. And that in many ways, Clare's participation in the Eucharist, her union with Jesus that she experienced in the Eucharist, was a union with a Jesus who expressed himself in his pouring himself out for us, his utter self-emptying, and that a Eucharist is our transformation into this image of Jesus who exists to serve one another. In this, she followed very, very much, of course, the teachings of Francis himself. When we look at, for example, the first admonition of Francis, where he refers the friars to the person of Jesus and talking about the centrality of Christ. And therefore, Francis goes in the first admonition, "Therefore, sons of men, how long will you be hard of heart? Why do you not recognize the truth and believe in the Son of God? See, daily he humbles himself, as when he came from the royal throne into the womb of the Virgin. Daily he comes to us in a humble form. Daily he comes down from the heart of the Father upon the altar in the hands of the priest." So that Francis sees in the Eucharist the self-emptying of Jesus, a reminder of who Jesus is for us. And again, the passage that perhaps many of you are familiar with, the passage from the letter to the order that we see Francis referring to and calling the whole order to recognize in the self-emptying